Last week, we talked about the fact that God expects that our gifts to Him will be costly. And we ended with the question, well, how costly? Just how much are we supposed to give? And I promised that this week I'd tell you that, so let's get to it. In 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 2, Paul says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those you accredited by letter to carry your grace to Jerusalem." Now, the operative phrase here is, "as God has prospered you." But what does that mean? And here's where people really begin to get having belly aching ninny fits. I don't know what it means, but I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean the tithe. It can't mean the tithe because we're free from the law. And boy, howdy, do people love being free from the law when it comes to tithing. Now, the same people have a conniption fit whenever someone talks about taking the Ten Commandments down from one of our halls of justice, because there's a great deal of reverence and respect for thou shalt not kill, but there's really utter disdain for bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse that there may be meat in mine house, Malachi 3:10. Never mind that both are ordained by God, that both are expressions of the greatest command, to love the Lord with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. It has not escaped my attention that there are plenty of people in the church who love the law when it suits them and who hate it when it doesn't, and who play the free from the law card usually only when money is involved. Although sometimes they'll play it when Sabbath keeping is involved. I'm not sure why. Nevertheless, as insincere as that argument usually is, it's not always insincere, but it often is. It is a legitimate argument. We are free from the law. The law is not our master. The law, as Paul puts it in Galatians 3:24, is our school master, our tutor. Let me ask you something. Are we all finished? We're done learning? Have we reached perfection? Does our schoolmaster have nothing left to teach us anymore? Back in the mid-1930s, the Metropolitan Opera House established a rule: no encores. No matter how good a performance was, no matter how long the audience cheered, no matter how loudly or insistently the audience shouted for an encore, no encore was forthcoming. Even when Leontine Price brought the house down with La Canzone di Doretta from La Rondine, even though the audience applauded till some of them were bleeding from their hands, shouting and cheering for over 14 minutes, and Ms. Price was lying prostrate on the stage, sobbing, because she was so moved and humbled by their appreciation, no encore was given, not allowed. Until 2008, when Juan Diego Flores tore the roof off the building by singing A Mes Amis from the Daughter of the Regiment with more mastery, skill, and beauty than was shown by Pavarotti when he did the same in 1967. And the audience broke out in an utter melee. That's when the artistic director called the pit and said, "Give the audience an encore." Now, this fellow, Juan Diego Flores, who's now heralded as the best tenor alive, he has a voice coach, a tutor. He always has, and he always will. John Rahm has a coach, a tutor. Caleb Dressel has a coach, a tutor. And the Apostle Paul had a coach, a tutor, the law. And he consulted her to guide his conscience constantly. And he tells us that the law is our schoolmaster, our tutor. Now, I don't suppose any of us has a better mastery of the mind of God than Juan Diego Flores has over his own voice. I don't suppose any of us have a better mastery over the seas of life's change than Caleb Dressel has over the waves of an Olympic pool. Of course not. Yet, all of these not only have tutors, but they listen to their tutors and heed their advice. God gave us a tutor because we need a tutor. Now, you're right. We are not beneath the law. But the law is not beneath us either. The law is beneath God. And we're beneath God. And God says, church, you would do well to listen to your older sister. I've told her some things that I haven't told you. And you still have her close at hand. She's right there for you to consult whenever you need to. So let's consult her. When Paul said, you are to give as God has prospered you, he obviously intended to indicate proportional giving. He clearly intended that the amount that we would give would have some relationship to the amount that we've received, and that relationship would be a direct correspondence of some kind. That in some sense, what you give would be determined by what you've received. Now, the last time I taught a class on giving, someone asked me, well, why do I have to consider my giving in terms of relation to my income at all? Why can't it just be whatever I've determined in my heart? Why does it have to be a percentage? And my answer was, it will be a percentage of your income. No matter how you arrive at the figure, no matter what criteria you use to determine what your gift will be, when you give it, it will be a portion of your income. I mean, let's say you earn $100 a week. When the collection plate comes around, you give no thought to what you'll give whatsoever. You simply reach in your pocket, throw in some loose change without even looking. Well, even though you don't know the proportion that gift has, the relationship that it has to your income, the fact remains. If it turns out that handful of change adds up to exactly $1, you've given 1% of your income. And you know that. The reason why we determine our giving by proportion to our income is because that's the criteria that God uses. Paul says, let your giving be done in proportion to what God has given you. So let's not pretend that proportional giving is foreign to the new covenant. Rather, let's follow what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 16 to its logical conclusion. After all, what proportion do you think Paul had in mind when he told us to give as God has prospered us? I mean, he didn't specify a proportion, but he did know one. The one ordained by God in the document that Paul refers to as our God-appointed tutor. So let's consult our tutor, see what she has to say about this. Now, the simplest interpretation of the law is that the law, generally speaking, required worshipers under the Old Covenant to give a tithe, that is 10% on one's net annual income. And some Old Testament scholars find just that in the law of Moses, the command to give 10%. However, there's actually more to it than that. A careful reading of the Old Testament reveals that the letter of the law required more of a faithful person than to give 10% of their net income. Let's turn, for instance, to Leviticus 27:30 through 33. And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord. If a man will redeem aught of his tithe, he shall add unto it a fifth part thereof. And concerning the tithe of the herd or of the flock, even of whatsoever passes under the rod, the 10th shall be holy unto the Lord. He shall not search whether it be good or bad, neither shall he change it. And if he changes it at all, then both it and that for which it is changed shall be holy. It shall not be redeemed. Now, first, I'd like to point out from this text that the statement, the tithe belongs to the Lord, isn't a command. It's a fact. The statement isn't part of the law, properly speaking. It's a statement of fact, a premise upon which the command is based. Now, Abraham recognized that. Abraham was long before the law. He came along long before the law was ever in place, and he tithed because he knew that the tithe is holy to the Lord. The tithe belongs to the Lord whether we give it to him or not. And according to Malachi 3:8, we're thieves and robbers if we don't turn over to him what already belongs to him. Second, we see that the tithe consists of the land, the seed of the land, the fruit of the tree, and the herds of the flocks, which covers just about everything because produce and livestock were the currency of exchange of the economy of the ancient Near East. The economy at the time of Moses was an agrarian barter economy, and in such an economy, crops and livestock are money. However, we should also note that though cash was dispreferred in the time of Moses, it was acceptable, but there was a surcharge for using cash. Leviticus 27:31, if a man will redeem aught of his tithe, he shall add unto it a fifth part thereof. So if your 10th cow weighs 1,000 pounds and beef on the hoof is 20 cents a pound, that animal's worth $200. But if you want to keep the cow and give cash instead, you have to add a fifth part thereof. That is, you have to add 20% to its value. So you'd have to give $240 in its place. So the rate of the tithe would be 10% if you give it in the usual currency of exchange of crops and livestock, but 12% if you give it in cash. But let's make it easy on ourselves. I mean, the math is easier if we stick with 10%, and cash is the usual currency of exchange for our economy, for our society. So it could be argued that the surcharge should be added if we want to give our tithe in any form other than cash. So let's take that interpretation and let's stick with 10% rather than 12%. Well, 10% of what? Well, according to verse 32 of Leviticus 27, 10% of that which passes under the rod. And the way that this was done is that the worshiper would put all his sheep in a fold and then let them out through a narrow gate. And as they passed through, he counted, and every 10th one would be tapped on the head. That was part of the tithe. So it was a tithe on what he actually had. Now, wait a minute, you might say. I mean, some of those sheep are last year's sheep. They've already been counted. I started off with 200 sheep this year. Now I've got 250. So my income for the year is only 50 sheep. I should only have to give 5 sheep, not 25. Well, your math is different from God's math. The tithe wasn't just on income, it was on holdings as well. Now, by the same token, suppose that this guy's flock at one point of the year was 300 sheep strong, but he ate some of them and used some of them to pay his bills. Well, God didn't hold that guy accountable for the cost of doing business, just for his net profits, plus his holdings. So in modern terms, the tithe, if we were legally bound to it, which we're not, would be 10% of your net income plus, on an annualized basis, 10% of what you have in the bank. Now, where did that first tithe go? Well, according to Numbers 18, 21 through 24, that went to the Levites. All of it. None of it was kept by the worshiper. None of it went to charity. None of it was for the poor. It all went to the Levites. And if you consult 1 Corinthians 9, 13 through 14 on this matter, you'll find that that corresponds with the church and the ministers thereof. 1 Corinthians 9, 13 through 14 Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings in the same way? The Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. So, by way of application, if we were bound by the law, the first tithe, 10% of your annual income, 10% of your holdings would go to the church. Now, what about charity? And what do you mean by first tithe? Are you saying there were 2 tithes? No, there were 3. The first tithe went to the Levites, which correspond to the church. The second tithe, which is described in Deuteronomy 14:22 through 27, was also the tithe of everything, crops, oil, wine, herds, flocks. However, it was a tithe on everything that was left after the first tithe. So it wouldn't actually be the full 10%, it'd be 9%. It'd be a tithe on 90% of what you have. And this tithe could be shared by the Levites, but they were not to be the primary recipients of it. This tithe was used to make 3 pilgrimages a year for 3 feasts: the Feast of the Passover, the Feast of Tabernacles, and the Feast of Weeks. Now, unlike the first tithe, the second tithe could be converted into cash without penalty. And this tithe, the worshiper did partake in, and he could share it with anyone he pleased, including the Levites. The money was for feasts dedicated to God. It's out of this second tithe that worshipers were to take their offerings for these feasts. That's how the Passover feasts and all the sin offerings and guilt offerings and so on for the other feasts were funded from the second tithe. Now, the overall purpose of the sacred feasts was to foster religious principles among the religious community at large. This had to do with teaching your faith to your children and celebrating your faith in fellowship with the community, with other faithful people. But it also had to do with atoning for your sin through your giving, paying your vows, and paying your penalties. Now, one time someone asked me, well, if I spend a great deal of money on my children's education, on Christian schools, can I count that as part of my giving? Now, again, I'm not trying to be legalistic about this here. You're not legally obligated in your giving under the New Testament. But having said that, if you are disposed to follow this model, if you are disposed to allow your tutor to inform your conscience about your giving, you're free to follow this model. And with this in mind, I said, well, yes, but if you want to be faithful to the model, don't deduct that money you're spending on Christian education from your first tithe. That goes to the church, all of it, full stop. No, deduct it from your second tithe. The second tithe of the Old Testament symbolizes in type and shadow your Christian giving. You're giving to Christian causes that go beyond your commitment to your local congregation. So it can go to Christian causes and causes that promote Christian values. And since you're allowed to partake in the joy of your giving of the second tithe, this money could go for that $1,000 a plate fundraising dinner, or to buy Girl Scout cookies, or Christmas gifts, or Easter seals, or to sponsor rubber duckies as part of a charity rubber ducky race. So if you were setting aside money for the second tithe, you'd have a built-in budget for every kind of planned giving over and above what you give to the church. And since this tithe is also for paying your vows and penalties, then if you get a speeding ticket, you've already got that money set aside. That's what it's for. And I think that if you want to make political contribution, that's where this money should come from. It's from the second tithe. And then there's the third tithe. The third tithe is described in Deuteronomy 14:28 through 29. And that tithe was specifically for charity, specifically for almsgiving, for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. Now that tithe was also 10% of one's income, but of course it comes out after the first tithe and after the second tithe. So it's really only about 8% of your income, and mercifully it was only given once every 3 years. So on an annualized basis, the third tithe comes to about 3% of your annual income. And just to be clear, 3% is rounded up, not down. You could just as easily go with 2% or 2.5%. But let's go ahead and round up in addition to the third tithe, because all Israelites were also required to leave gleanings in their fields for the poor. So the third tithe is for that homeless guy at the gas station who asks you for a few dollars. It's for the person in line behind you at the drive-thru whose bill you pay spontaneously. It's for the exceptionally generous tip that you leave for that charmless and forlorn server who gave you adequate service and is clearly in need of a pick-me-up today. It's for the person in front of you in line at the grocery store whose EBT card has just been rejected and they're about to be embarrassed by having to put their groceries back. That's the third tithe. That's what that's for. Now, when you read the biblical record on these tithes, you may find it difficult to distinguish between the three tithes, but we have ample testimony that this is the way that the law was known and understood by the Jewish community in first century Palestine. For instance, in Antiquities, Book 4, Josephus says, "Besides those two tithes which I've already said you are to pay every year, the one for the Levites, the other for the festivals, you are to bring every third year tithe to be dispersed to those who are in want, to women also, and to widows, and to children, and to the orphans." So if we wanted to maintain the same standard for ourselves in the church, we'd all be giving about 22% of our net income and holdings every year, giving 10% directly to the church, to our local congregation, 9% for things like Christian education, missions, Christmas gifts, etc., causes that directly advance the Christian enterprise, and 3% for the poor. Now, at this point, you may be saying to yourself, well, good grief. I came in here hoping that Joe wouldn't say anything about tithing, because 10% of my income is simply too much for me to give. But now I'm told that the tithes of the Old Testament are actually 22%. Thank God we're free from the law. Really dodged a bullet there. And you're right, 10% does seem like a lot if you're not used to giving that much, or if you're not disposed to giving that amount. And 22% seems astronomical, unless you take into account that most of the additional 12% is for stuff that you already spend money on. And you're right, we are free from the law. Paul simply says to give as God has prospered you. No one's legally obligated to give any specific amount under the new covenant. Under the new covenant, we believe that we are bound by conscience to do only whatever we receive by command, example, or necessary inference. So let's take a look at some of the New Testament examples of giving and see what we find. Matthew 19:21, find the following. Jesus said unto him, If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell all that thou hast, and give it to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me. Now here Jesus isn't recommending the Old Testament tithe. He's recommending the giving of 100%. Now this, of course, is what Jesus said to the rich young ruler. And frankly, almost no one takes that seriously. No one really takes that to heart, not for themselves. No, this is what Jesus told that guy to do because that guy had a problem. He was rich, and apparently he was also selfish. So Jesus told him how he could attain to perfection. But that doesn't apply to me. I'm not rich. I'm not selfish. So yes, Jesus told one guy to give 100%, but it surely doesn't mean for all of us to give 100%. Well, I think you're probably right about that. Though he did have high praise for those who did that very thing. Mark 12:41 through 44. And Jesus sat over against the treasury and beheld how the people cast money into the treasury. And many that were rich cast in much. And there came a certain poor widow, and she threw in 2 mites, which make a farthing. And he called unto him his disciples, and he said to them, Verily I say unto you, that this poor widow has cast in more than all the others which have cast into the treasury. For all they did cast in of their abundance, but she of her want did cast in all that she had, even all her living. Clearly, Jesus had a high level of appreciation for this woman who gave 100%. Now, believe it or not, I've actually heard people say, well, it's easier to give everything when you don't have anything. If I was in this woman's position, I'd have given 100% too. Would you? Really? Well, some Christians would. Some Christians have. Acts 2, 44 through 45, and 4, 32 through 35. And all that believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and parted them to all men, as every man had need. And the multitude of them that believed were of one heart and of one soul. Neither said any of them that aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. And with great power gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the Lord. And great grace was upon them all. Neither was there any among them that lacked. For as many as were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the prices of the things that were sold, and laid them down at the apostles' feet. And distribution was made unto every man according as he had need. Now, beloved, under the new covenant, we are free from the law. We're not under the law. We're under grace. And the first Christians knew that. They understood that. According to Acts 4:33, great grace was upon them all. And having been set free from the law, free from the tithe, and placed under grace, what did they do? Well, just like so many modern Christians, they decided that tithing was unacceptable. They simply wouldn't do it. We're not going to tithe. We're not going to be subject to the law. Wouldn't be caught dead giving 22% of their income. That would nullify grace if they were to bind themselves to the law in that way. And they certainly wouldn't be caught dead giving 10% of their income. No, they weren't slaves to the law. The only acceptable thing for them to do was to give 100%. Now, Joe, that's not fair. I mean, these people were first-hand witnesses of the crucifixion and the resurrection and the Pentecost. Surely they were caught up in a fervor. You can't call this kind of giving normative for the church. And I have to say you're right about that. I happen to be of the opinion that that kind of giving is impractical in the extreme and is ultimately unsustainable. I think that's one of the reasons for some of the problems that they had in the Jerusalem church. Peter, James, and John had a nickname for themselves, a title of honor that they used for themselves. They called themselves the poor. And where did that name come from? Well, at least in part, I think it came from the fact that the Jerusalem church isolated itself from society and became a closed community with a communal economy. And eventually they were poor, because everyone had sold everything that they had and gave their liquid assets to the church and quit their jobs and let the church support them. And if you know anything about economic theory, you know that that won't work. It is unsustainable in the long run. Now, Paul didn't do that. Paul planted churches that remained intact in their society at large. The church members remained employed, remained productive, and gave week by week. And how much did they give? Well, we don't have very much information about that. We do have a report on the Macedonians and how much they gave. 2 Corinthians 1, 8 through 4 Actually, it's 2 Corinthians 8 through 4. Moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the fulfillment of their purpose. For I bear witness that according to their power, yes, and beyond their power, they were freely willing, imploring us with much urgency that we would take into our hands the grace they were sowing, and so participate together with them in ministering to the holy ones. So how much did the Macedonians give? Well, not 10%, not 22%, not 100%. According to Paul, they gave 110%. They didn't just give more than they could afford. The language here strongly indicates that they gave more than they even had. They borrowed money to give to the church. That's what freedom from the law produces in people who want to give. But believe it or not, there's one person in the Bible who gave even more than that. In Luke 10, you've got the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, the Samaritan didn't give all that he had, at least not right away. Instead, you know the story. He wrote a blank check. He gave the innkeeper his promise that he would pay the bill for taking care of this injured man, whatever the cost might be. Now, can you imagine that, offering to pay somebody's hospital bill, no matter how much it came to? And this guy wasn't just going to be there a day or two. Remember, he was beaten till he was half dead. The Samaritan opened himself up to unlimited liability. So the potential was there for him to give 100% of what he had, and then some for years to come. Now, I could give more examples, but no more needed. You get the idea. Paul's command to all the churches is that week by week we're to give, and that giving is to be done proportionally as God has prospered us. And I started this lesson with the question, well, what proportion did Paul have in mind? And since Paul's words are God-breathed, what proportion did God have in mind? Well, the answer that I've given you is, if you let the Old Testament inform your conscience, then the very least, the starkest interpretation of God's intention and expectation is that the faithful will give 10% of their net income. Now, if you let the New Testament inform your conscience on this matter, the possibilities are endless. They start with the giving of lands and houses, and then go to 100%, and with faith beyond 100%. How much should you give? Beloved, that's between you and God. I don't know how much anybody in this congregation gives, and I don't want to know. The purpose of this lesson is to inform your conscience and set the bar ditches. What we receive under the new covenant is far superior to what the Israelites received under the old covenant. And frankly, I don't know how any Christian in good conscience determines in their heart that they ought to give less than faithful Jews gave under the old covenant. On the other end of the spectrum, I'm too practical and perhaps too fearful, not faithful enough to do anything as impulsive as to give 100% of my income and just allow God to take care of me. Frankly, I think that my income is the means by which God takes care of me financially, and I simply can't see my way clear to giving away 100% of it. It doesn't make sense to me. How much should you give? I don't know exactly. But my best counsel is that the right amount for you lies somewhere between 10% of your net income and 100%. Now, it's up to you to work out the details between you and God. Wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God which works in you both to will and to do according to his good pleasure. Philippians 2:12 through 13. And that's my lesson for today.